For the next 30 minutes, we're going to do some bioethics. A big shout out to my D and E block ethics sections who did some marvelous bioethics presentations. The topics went right to our speaker today. He's going to be focusing a lot on animal rights and that kind of thing. And also some vision of where things may be in the future. His name is Dr. Dom Sisti. A lot of faculty and myself have worked with him. PhD out of Michigan. Terrific guy. Has worked also with the Penn Center for Bioethics for their high school initiative. Right now he's dealing with research in the area of bioethics and mental health. Let's stand to greet a very special guy, Dom.
Oh, wow. Standing ovation already. Thank you. Thank you, Jim. I'm really delighted to be here. I actually, this is the first time I've been to your new campus. It's not new to you guys, but it's brand new to me, and it's wonderful. As Reverend Squire just mentioned, my name's Dom Sisti. I'm from the Penn Center for Bioethics. And today I want to talk to you briefly about a big question, which is, are animals persons? You can see here this, this big guy in the sink is my cat, Magellan, and he is 22 pounds, and if you asked him if he was a person, I bet you he'd say yes. I can tell you at 4 a.m. this morning, he thought he was a person when he riled me out of bed to actually feed him and get him some water. He had actually decided, I think, that he was hungry, and he took some actions to actually get himself fed, which to me is pretty good. It means he's pretty smart, okay? But there's debates about this, and what I want to do is spend some time philosophizing about this question. Are animals persons? It's a huge question. So today I'm only going to scratch the surface by presenting to you guys a few philosophical perspectives as well as a few contemporary bioethical perspectives. So if a bunch of you guys are in bioethics class. Some of these folks you'll remember. For those of you who haven't taken bioethics yet, this will be an introduction to hopefully when you do take bioethics class. Why does this question matter? Why does it matter whether or not we decide an animal is a person or not? Before looking, why don't you guys give me your hands and tell me what you think? Why does it matter? You can cheat if you want, but it matters because, go ahead. Go ahead. Why does it matter if we decide an animal is a person or not? Yeah. Right. So there's laws in place to protect animals. We have to figure out whether or not they're legitimate laws, whether or not they're a little bit over the top. Really, in the end, it's an important question because, one, many of us eat animals. So if we decide they're persons, that's a problem, right? Scientists use animals for research. You guys in biology lab probably use animals, whether or not they're probably mostly dead animals, but some of you might use live worms or something to learn about biology, right? You dissect animals. If they're persons, that's problematic, right? People hunt animals for food and for sport, okay? Animals are kept in captivity, right? When you go to the zoo, for example, there's animals that are in cages, and would we find it objectionable if we put a bunch of people in a cage and looked at them? Would that be problematic? Well, if animals are like persons, then that's equally problematic. To put them in cages just to look at them and learn from them or see them as entertainment value in circuses, that's problematic, right? And then, of course, entertainment, like circuses and other types of less innocent forms of entertainment, which we'll talk about later on when I mention Michael Vick. What is a person? Well, this is a big philosophical question, and the way we answer this question will determine whether or not animals are actually considered a person. Some philosophers argue that persons are only entities that have the ability to make free, rational choices, okay? And they also should have a genetic makeup that is similar to humans. So some will argue that, oh, you have to be, have 46 chromosomes and be, human-like to be even thought of as a possible person. While others say, no, that doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter if you're genetically human. The only thing that matters is if you have the capacity for reason, for making choices, for determining what you want and going and getting it, just like Magellan did this morning. That was an act of personhood. And if we decide that animals are persons, what does this mean for our laws? It means that we have to give animals certain rights and protections and a level of respect that we might not give them right now, because we don't really think of them as persons right now. Right? Most of us don't think of animals as persons. We wouldn't say that a lobster is a person, would we? We wouldn't say that a lobster has the same right as a baby, or that a lobster should be treated with respect the same way we treat, say, even a dog with respect. Yet, there have been controversies over the years about the moral status of all animals, like even crustaceans, like lobsters. In fact, a ban was put in place at Whole Foods. You know Whole Foods, the supermarket? Whole Foods decided we're not going to carry live lobsters anymore. They used to have live lobsters in fish tanks in all their stores because various animal rights organizations protested that was cruel, that you're selling live lobsters only for them to go home to somebody's home to be boiled, right? And they said that's really wrong, that's cruel. So they banned the sale of live lobsters, except in one state. Anyone have a guess of where that is? Maine, all right, the big lobster state. So, one of the key questions here is, let me just skip to the philosophical perspectives, is how do we think about the notion of personhood vis-a-vis animals? Well, most philosophers, at least in the Western tradition, have thought of animals as less than human, okay? And this comes out of the sort of tradition from the ancient Greeks all the way on through the Anglophone English philosophers, contemporary moral philosophers. Anyone here take a philosophy? Do you guys have a philosophy course or anything? Yeah, so some philosophy. So this will be something you'll hear about as you get to college, but Western philosophy is defined mostly in terms of the philosophies of the ancient Greeks, okay? And really for the ancient Greeks like Plato and Aristotle, animals were second on the great chain of being. So Aristotle came up with this theory of how, there was, inanimate objects at the bottom, like rocks and dirt and soil, and then there was, vegetation, plants and trees and all sorts of other things like algae and other things. And then all the way up through animals, right? Non-human animals, and then humans. And then above humans were, sort of deities, and then God, and then angels, or angels and then God, right? So animals always took second seat to humans in Greek philosophy. And this was reiterated again in the Middle Ages by St. Thomas Aquinas, who saw animals as second to humans. St. Thomas Aquinas really takes Aristotle and makes it more Christian, makes Aristotle's philosophy more Christian, okay? And then a guy named René Descartes, a French philosopher, who said, he even went further and said, they're not even on the same level or the same continuum as humans. These animals, they basically function like alarm clocks, right? Or clocks with gears inside of them. When they make noises, when they express suffering or pain, that doesn't mean that they're really in pain. They're just automatic sort of, it's almost like when your iPhone makes an alert. It's been programmed to do that. Say you have a friend request on Facebook or a Scrabble play you have to make, and you get this buzz. Well, that's all animals do. They just buzz when there's a certain input, right? Like computers or machines. That's what René Descartes said. And in fact, the Cartesian tradition, that's what you call a tradition that's based in Descartes, is the Cartesian tradition, is really the foundation for the early animal research movement, or vivisection movement, which was the cutting of animals while they're alive to watch them function, basically. Watch their hearts beat, watch their muscles twitch, watch their digestive systems work. Okay, so early vivisectionists we're Cartesians through and through. Immanuel Kant is a German philosopher who also thought that animals were not persons. And Immanuel Kant is famous for saying that basically persons are those entities that have autonomy and they can reason and rationally make decisions. So for Immanuel Kant, there's no way a dog is a person because a dog can't reason through a particular problem and come up with a solution, okay? A dog has no way of making moral decisions, in other words. We all can make moral choices in our life, right? That's one thing that I think sets humans apart from animals. And that's what Kant would say is the reason why animals are not persons, because they can't make moral choices like you or I. They can't decide, you know what, I need to tell the truth in this situation, right? Lying is wrong, right? Or I'm not going to cheat on this exam because cheating is wrong. Those are moral choices that only humans really can make. An animal can't make such choices. It doesn't have the capacity to make those choices. And so for Kant, that capacity is what makes us human, and it separates us from all non-human animals, right? Okay? And it justifies us using animals in such a way that we can get things out of them if we treat them with respect. Now, it's interesting. Kant says one thing that I think is really actually true. He says, you know, we don't owe animals anything. We don't owe them extra special treatment or care. But we should respect them. We shouldn't abuse them. Okay? But he doesn't say that because he thinks animals suffer, per se. He said that because he thinks that is a habit that if you get into, if you hurt animals, you'll hurt humans too. And believe it or not, he's actually right. The social psychology on this has actually shown that people who hurt animals, who torture animals, actually hurt humans. Right? And so, while Kant didn't believe that animals had rights or were persons, he thought that the way we treated animals, right, was a sign or was a virtue, and it spoke to how we were going to treat other human beings. And that makes sense, right? Because animals are generally vulnerable, and if you're hurting a vulnerable thing, you're sort of acting in a way that's wrong and evil, right? And so, for Kant, that's his main argument about animals, but he doesn't think they're persons. Now, Jeremy Bentham, on the other hand, he's a philosopher from England, and he's probably best known as the first utilitarian philosopher. Does anyone have a clue what utilitarian is? No? Basically, the idea of utilitarianism is that you want to try to maximize the happiness of a group of people, okay? You want to strive to make decisions that make people happy, not sad, okay? Or do stuff that makes you feel good, okay? So the idea of utilitarianism is that you're trying to maximize your own pleasure. And so for Bentham, the idea here is that if an entity, say a human or an animal, can feel pleasure or pain, that's what makes them a person. Okay? So it doesn't really matter if an animal can rationalize, make free decisions, autonomous decisions. It's whether the animal can feel pain that legitimate persons, possible persons, as part of our moral community. And I think that that's a pretty compelling argument myself. I think that Jeremy Bentham was onto something, and we'll see how his philosophy has been taken up by another utilitarian at Princeton by the name of Peter Singer. In the Eastern tradition, we should be sure we mention that the Hindu tradition, the Buddhist tradition, the Jainist tradition, all have a sacred place for animals. Okay? Not necessarily because they're persons per se, but they're spiritually relevant. They may actually represent the soul of a lost descendant. They may be, the body or the place where a relative is now inhabiting en route to being reincarnated. Okay, so in the Eastern tradition, animals have a very different place. The Western tradition is really based, and I didn't mention this, but the biblical accounts in the Western tradition have really set the precedent in the West in terms of how we think about animals. Because in the Bible, animals are thought of as human property that should be respected but used, right? Like we should use our ox or oxen to till the fields, to plow the fields. But we should give them a day of rest too, right? They're not persons. Now, in the Eastern philosophies, they're actually considered sacred in many philosophies. Most Hindus and Buddhists are vegetarian, although not all are, but they hold animals to a higher place. Now, let me just shift now and talk about some contemporary concepts of whether and how animals, this question of animals or persons. And I want to talk about Peter Singer, Tom Regan, and Art Kaplan, my friend and mentor at Penn. What I'm going to do here, I think I'm getting a little short on time, so I want to skip ahead and just mention Peter Singer. So some of you probably have heard about Peter Singer in your bioethics class. Peter Singer, philosopher at Princeton University, and he is best known for his work, which you can see the cover of here. It's called Animal Liberation, and it's probably the most well-read or widely circulating philosophy book on the market, which in philosophy numbers, that doesn't say too much. I mean, it's probably a few 100,000 compared to, say, The Hunger Games, which is millions of copies. But Peter Singer is a pretty famous guy, and he's said that if an animal can feel pain or if an entity can feel pain, then it has moral worth. In fact, he would say some animals have higher moral worth, right? Some animals are more of persons than some human people or than some human beings. Now, does this make any sense? Well, what might be an example of a case where an animal, a non-human animal, has higher moral status than, say, a human, for Peter Singer? Any philosophers want to venture at this? A case, yeah. Okay, so a rescue dog, and compare against what kind of human? Well, we could think of human beings that are very sick. Let's say they're in a persistent vegetative state, right? Which is a condition in which a person isn't able to interact with the world anymore. It's kind of like a coma, not completely like it, but they're awake. They're sort of alert, but not really. If you guys, you're probably too young to remember the case of Terry Schiavo, but she was in a persistent vegetative state. And Peter Singer would say, it is clear to me that a rescue dog or a chimp or an orangutan has a higher moral status than someone like Terry Schiavo, who can't interact in the world, who can't desire anything or act on any preferences, okay? Because he's a preference utilitarian. That's his technical method. So this is what Peter Singer said. You can see how it would get rather controversial, right? Some animals have higher moral worth than some humans. And he says that we come at animals with this bias that we don't even realize we have, which he titles speciesism. He says, you know, our worldview is such that animals are so beneath us that we can eat them, that we can hunt them, that we can research on them. We don't even question it, right? And that's actually akin to racism or sexism. You know, back in the day, in the 1800s, let's say, in the US, slavery was considered sort of normal. African Americans were considered non-human. They were considered slaves. They were meant to be slaves. That was what they were naturally designed to be in that parlance, in that context, right? And so what Singer argues is that we have a similar paradigm right now in that we think of animals as less than us, right? That we can take them, we can cut them open, we can look inside them, we can eat them, we can shoot them, we can do whatever, right? Because they're less than us. But he says, why? Why should we feel that way? They sense pain. They have attachments. Elephants, for example, develop relationships with mating partners that last a lifetime. When one dies, they mourn, right? There's a whole emotional complexity to the cultures of these higher vertebrates like dolphins and elephants, dogs, pigs, etc. So he says there's no real reason why we shouldn't see this for what it is, which is indiscriminate arbitrary bias. And he says, what the experimenter, this is probably a little too small for you to read, so I'll read it out loud. What the experiment, and this is about research ethics, this is about doing animal research, okay? So he says, would the experimenter be prepared to perform his experiment on an orphan human infant if that were the only way to save many lives? If the experimenter is not prepared to use an infant, then his readiness to use non-humans as simple discrimination, since adult apes, cats, mice, and other mammals are more aware of what is happening to them, more self-directed, and so far as we can tell, at least as sensitive to pain as any human infant. So this is a pretty bold point. He's saying, why wouldn't you use an infant in a research study over an animal? Right? And he makes the caveat here that it's an orphaned infant. That way you wouldn't have to think about parental interests here. But what he's trying to get at here is that, we make we take these positions that are arbitrary. When you think of an ape in its family, has a family structure much like humans, but we want to use a chimp, let's say, in a research study. Whereas if you ask the person, well, why not use a human infant? They would shudder. It would be repugnant. Okay? So, for Singer, there's really no good reason to use animals in research. However, he is a utilitarian, which means you have to maximize the good for the most number of people. And in about 2006, he made waves by saying, you know what, in some cases, it might be justifiable to use an animal in research. So if animals were the only way to find a cure for, say, Parkinson's disease, and you could determine that sacrificing one animal would save hundreds of lives, thousands of lives, then yes, possible. Now, what do you think Peter Singer would say about Michael Vick? You guys all know who Michael Vick is, I assume. And I assume you all know why Michael Vick got himself into some trouble a few years back, right? Because he was involved in dogfighting, right? And dogfighting isn't as benign as it sounds. It's actually more like dog torture than, dogs boxing or something. What do you think Peter Singer would say about Michael Vick? Anyone know? Anyone have a guess? Would he be upset about it? Yeah, of course. Well, believe it or not, he was upset. But what he said was, you know what? All these people are upset about Michael Vick, and they're throwing stones at Michael Vick because he's just an awful guy and he did all these awful things to dogs. But you know what? These are the same people that don't even think about what's done to a pig when they go into a supermarket and buy bacon, or what's done to a cow before they order a hamburger at McDonald's, right? And so what he said was pretty interesting, because he kind of shifted it away from Michael Vick and tried to argue again, look, we have this indiscriminate worldview, and it's biased, okay? Now, and by the way, guys, I'm not sure, I don't agree with Singer on some of these things. I agree with some of his arguments, but on others, I don't necessarily agree. I actually eat meat, just as a disclaimer. I'm not a vegetarian. But his arguments, I think, are really compelling, and there's something to consider, okay, and something to debate about. Tom Regan actually has a very different approach to arguing that animals are persons. He says that animals are persons because they're subjects of a life. They have a history, and they can, engage with one another in a long process of, relationship. And he calls for total abolition of the use of animals in science. So he's much more categorical than Peter Singer, believe it or not. Total dissolution of commercial agriculture, animal agriculture. So getting rid of those big factory farms that you all hear about, those should be illegal. Total elimination of sport hunting and trapping. And he refutes the argument that animals are our resources. Okay? So that's Tom Regan. How am I on time, Reverend Squire? Another minute? Two? Okay. I don't want to take up too much more time, but I have to mention Art Kaplan, who's my good friend and mentor from Penn, who's actually, unfortunately, now leaving Penn and heading up to NYU for a big job up at NYU. But Art says that, you know what, animals deserve respect, but we need to be sure that we remember that humans also need respect, and it is legitimate to use them in research under the right conditions, minimizing the harm and suffering of animals. And so that's Art's. He's got a few papers on this. So in the end, let me just wrap up here by saying, what do you guys think? Are animals persons? Well, it's hard to say. Some philosophers say yes, some bioethicists say no, some philosophers say no, some bioethicists say yes. There's a long tradition of debate about this, what's up to you guys to do now is to think about the arguments. You only got a tiny little snippet of them here today, but go out and read. Read about these positions. Read about the philosophies that ground these arguments, that make these arguments work, okay? Take some time, go online, read about Peter Singer, read about to think that animal use is okay. You know, try to come up with your own position. Debate the arguments respectfully with your friends and teachers, okay, and parents, okay? And come up with your own position. This is what bioethics is about, okay? It's learning about the issues, coming up with arguments, debating them, and finding your own positions. Now, who knows? Maybe in a few years, the question of whether or not we should eat meat and animal rights will go away. How? Well, they're developing ways to actually grow meat in petri dishes outside of animals. So, we can maybe get around one of the big questions about animal use and using animals by using hamburgers that are literally grown in a laboratory. Would you guys eat that? Why? No? Why not? It's not the same. It's the same thing. It's just muscle fiber. It's grown in a petri dish. It sounds delicious to me. So the point here is, guys, take time, think about these issues, talk about petri dish hamburgers today at lunch, okay? And think about whether or not you think your pets are persons, a cow on a feedlot is a person, an elephant in a zoo is a person, whether your brother or sister is a person, and how they all compare. Here's some info for you guys if you're interested. Go to the Penn High School Bioethics site. There's more information there. We have internships for seniors usually, summer internships and different activities. If you're interested, you can contact myself or Reverend Squire. We have if anyone's interested in coming to Penn, there's an undergraduate bioethics minor starting in a year. There's also a master's degree in bioethics, but there's other schools that have bioethics programs going on too. So if you're interested in doing bioethics in college, again, you know, send your questions via Reverend Squire, and I'll be happy to help you. Let's take a few minutes for questions. Do we have time for questions? Two or three questions, or minutes for questions. There's got to be somebody has to have a question. Oh, go ahead. Yeah. What's the great question? What would Peter Singer's position be, or my position actually, on domestic pets basically, who need humans to survive? And really the argument there is, are we harming the animal? And the answer is no. They're actually in a symbiotic relationship with us. So my cat Magellan is in a symbiotic relationship with me. He would never survive out in the wild, trust me. He is not going to survive in the wild. I'm not keeping him captive. You could keep the door open all day and he will stay in, and he will look for food in the house. So he's in a symbiotic relationship with us, me and my wife, and it works out fine. The question is, are they in distress or suffering, okay? So your dog that, is pretty much happy in your house or running around in your backyard, no problem for Peter Singer, okay? Yeah, yep. Euthanasia? Wow, euthanasia of animals? Oh, okay, I thought you meant of humans. Euthanasia of animals. I think it's okay to euthanizing animals. It has to... Right, so when a dog gets old, is it okay to euthanize your pet, let's say? And the answer, in my opinion, is yes, it is, to minimize the harm and suffering of the animal, to minimize the suffering of the owners, and this is going to be controversial, to minimize cost for prolonged treatment that might not work. I thought you were going to ask me about euthanasia, Peter Singer. Human euthanasia. Oh, okay. So that would be my position on that. And I don't think that that's too radical. Yeah. Good question. Right. This is a great question. What are the options if we abolish animal research? Right? What's out there? What are the alternatives to to doing biomedical research without animals? It's a great question. And really, there isn't much. Right now, you know, some of the arguments are we can use tissue culture, we can use computer models, we can do all sorts of fancy things in labs, but nothing gets you to the point where an organism model, full organism, will get you right now. Okay, and that's one thing Tom Regan argues, is that we need to develop better models that are alternatives to animals. Good question. I think this is it. Thanks, guys. Thanks.